Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Reformed GGA, and today we're going to go over the results of how my AK performed on its first 2 deer hunts ever. Now those of you who know me know that I don't hunt, so its first 2 deer hunts were not with me. Instead, there is a friend of mine who wanted to borrow the gun so that his daughters could use it. He does have a couple of hunting rifles that he would certainly not have any problem letting them use, but they don't usually do as well with those guns. His daughters are a little bit on the recoil sensitive side, and the guns that he has are not terribly forgiving in terms of eye relief, and they're also full-size cartridges. One is a 30-06, that's definitely a full-size rifle cartridge. The other one is a 7mm 08, which doesn't have as much recoil, but it still has a full-size charge there. It's basically a 308 that's been necked down to 7mm, so the charge is virtually the same. So there's still, full power energy there. And with a relatively short eye relief on the scopes that are there, it just tends to make his daughters a little bit on the jumpy side. There's definitely some shot anticipation there. And so this year, instead of kind of suffering through those guns, they asked to borrow mine because they have shot mine before on days where we have outings to go shooting and those kinds of things. They've been with a couple of times, and they usually do pretty decent with it, and they're fairly comfortable with it in terms of the whole shot anticipation thing. And that makes sense when you consider the gun. This, for those of you who don't know, is a Palmetto State Armory AK-103. That's what they call it. It's not a true 103, but it bears kind of a superficial resemblance to one. I've talked about all that in the video where I first talked about my AK-103. Not a true 103, but bears a resemblance to it. And this gun, I have, of course, put my own furniture on it. Well, I bought the furniture from Magpul and put it on it. But this is not the furniture that it came with. So it has an MOE handguard on it. It has the Magpul grip on it, and this is the rubberized one. Has the Zukov side folding stock with a 3/4 inch cheek riser on it. It also has an ALD trigger on it. It has a full auto selector, which actually wound up becoming an issue on the first hunt, so we'll talk about that. But it has a full auto selector on it that has an extended tab that you can use with your index finger, which is great. And you'll also notice a notch up front that can be used to hold the bolt open, which is a nice thing to have. And then the optic on it is a primary arms 3x prism scope. This is kind of the old model of 3x prism scope from primary arms. They have a new micro version that's out now that weighs a little bit less. Actually, it's about half the weight. But I went with this version first of all because the new version wasn't out yet, and I actually really like this particular optic. I really like the reticle in it. And to me, it just seems like a very beefy kind of overbuilt optic, and I like something that's a little bit more on the rugged side. That being said, even though the optic itself is quite rugged, prism scopes in general tend to be quite rugged. It's not unique to this particular prism scope. But even though the optic itself is quite rugged, the one thing that does need to be mentioned is that the caps that come with it are fairly basic caps. They're basically just held by tension, and so you can slide them on and off pretty easily. Of course, they do make caps for optics that are actually secured to the optic itself, and they don't come off very easily. But these ones were just the generic caps that the optic came with, and so that's what they wound up running when they were deer hunting, and that also became an issue. We'll discuss that. And that optic is held on with the master mounts. This is a relatively common item for AKs. This is the rear biased master mount that is holding that 3x prism scope in there. It's a very secure mounting system. As you can see, it's definitely a little bulky, but it is very secure. Very repeatable zero. And then, of course, last and definitely not least was the Magpul 10-round magazine. This was used just simply to ensure that they didn't have a bunch of extra space, and right now I'm just checking to make sure that the gun is clear, and it is. But they went with the 10-round magazine just because they didn't want something that huge sticking off the front end that could snag on brush and logs and other things that they would find in the field. And also, of course, a shorter magazine allows you to get closer to the ground if you need to do a prone shot or something like that. So a shorter magazine is oftentimes more practical for that kind of situation. Obviously, if this gun was being run as a self-defense gun, you're usually not going to go prone for that, and something that would happen across the bedroom. If you need to go prone to make a shot inside the house, you really need to work on your accuracy skills. But like I said, out in the field and when hunting, getting prone can be a good thing, and also making sure that it doesn't snag on brush and things like that do make the little 10-rounders a little bit more practical. Then, last but not least, I think I already mentioned the AL trigger that I put in there, and last but not least, the sling is just a Victor's Tactical AK sling, fairly generic, nothing overly special in and of itself. But yeah, that is the gun, and this is the configuration in which it was shot. The ammunition that was used was a fairly generic ammunition that, when it was commonly available, it was usually pretty cheap. It is just some soft point ammunition, and this stuff was sold in the Wolf packaging. Wolf oftentimes will sell from various different factories. The head stamp on this one is the Barnaul head stamp, so this was made at the Barnaul factory in Russia. And of course now we have the Russian ammo ban, and so getting things like this is not really going to happen. But I had a bunch of this stuff left over, and as far as ammunition that we could put in the gun that would be suitable for hunting, this was basically the only option that we had. It is soft point ammunition, so it's going to do more damage to, we'll say, squishy targets than normal full metal jacket ammunition does. Normal full metal jacket ammunition usually just goes through squishy targets and doesn't do a whole lot of damage. Proper soft point, though, not a hollow point. Hollow points are a little bit different when you're talking especially about Russian ammunition. They don't function like hollow points do in handguns at all. The hollow point there is actually just there for accuracy. It doesn't actually really increase the effect on target. But soft points, that's another ball of wax. Soft points tend to be pretty effective on squishy targets, at least provided that you're hitting the right target zone, we'll say. That also wound up becoming an issue. So that's the gun that was used. That was the ammunition that was used. Let's talk about how it went. Two young women going out with this gun, because it was easier for them to shoot, less felt recoil, winds up translating into more effectiveness, greater hit probability for them at the range, and things like that. Okay, so that's that. Easier for them to use. The first daughter goes out on her hunt, and she does wind up getting a deer. Both of them wind up getting a deer, so spoiler alert on that. But the first hunt, while they do get their deer, it doesn't go perfectly well. And part of this is on them, and that they need to take a little bit more time to train. And then part of it was on me for not explaining some things about the gun. So they go out there, they spot the deer, and there's a few other deer that are around at the time, but they spot the deer and they take the shots. I'm trying to remember exactly what the distance was. I told them that with this particular setup, it's probably not a good idea to go over 200 yards. And most of that just has to do with the accuracy limits of this ammunition. This ammunition is not terribly precise, especially if you're feeding it in and out of the gun multiple times. You feed it into the gun to take it out, and lo and behold, you don't get a deer, and so you unload the gun at the end of the day. Well, loading it and unloading it can really mess up that exposed lead tip, and it makes the rounds fire somewhat inconsistently if you do that. If you're running the ammo through the gun a lot and through the magazines and all that a lot, you usually wind up with like a 3 to 3.5 MOA ammo. And that's not necessarily bad. It's certainly suitable for deer hunting. For deer hunting, your target zone is usually an 8 to 10 inch target zone, depending on the size of the deer. And a 3 to 3.5 MOA gun will be able to hit that size of target out to 200 yards, no problem. Past 200 yards, and especially depending on just exactly how far past, sometimes you don't have quite enough accuracy to guarantee that you're going to get that vital zone. And so my suggestion was stay within 200 yards. That's basically going to be the practical limit of this ammunition with this gun. So I'm pretty sure that they wound up taking the first shot inside of 200 yards, but the shot went wild. It did not go in the target zone. Instead, it wound up being a gut shot. And those of you guys who hunt already know what's going to transpire here. Gut shots are not desirable because they do not usually result in a quick kill. And from the sport side of it, hunting, of course, does have a lot of tradition and history in America and things like that, and a lot of places in the world as well. But the idea in the sport is to, of course, go out and gather meat for yourself, but to do it in a way that's relatively humane. And a gunshot can actually be quite humane if you're shooting in the right area. And what you're normally aiming for, unless you are a very precise shooter, then you might be able to go for something else. But for a lot of people with kind of a general accuracy limits that the average person, not necessarily the average shooter, but the average person would have, you're usually going to be trying to hit the lungs or the heart, or perhaps both, depending on what exactly the angles are. That's what you're going for, is heart and lung shots. And a heart and lung shot will usually put the animal down within about 30 seconds, and then, of course, death follows fairly shortly after it goes down. A gut shot, on the other hand, though, does not kill the animal very quickly at all. And one of the problems that we have with this particular gun is that this 7.62x39 ammunition, while it does have less felt recoil, because it's not a full-size 7mm 08 or a full-size 30-06, it does have less recoil, but the other side of that is that it also has less muzzle energy. And if you hit the wrong part of the animal, it will sometimes not have enough energy to go all the way through the animal. And in hunting, you usually prefer a through and through. You prefer for there to be both an entry wound and an extra exit wound so that you can get more bleed out from the animal, which means that it tires more quickly and basically dies more quickly and that much more humanely. A gut shot, though, with an intermediate cartridge like this, and it being a soft point that is designed to do a lot of internal tissue damage, well, it dumps a lot of that energy a little bit too quickly when it's in the gut cavity instead of in the chest cavity. The chest cavity doesn't offer a whole lot of resistance to bullets. There's the hide that you have to get through and the rib cage that you have to get through. But once you get inside of that, the lungs and the heart really don't offer a whole lot of resistance, especially the lungs. The lungs are basically blood vessels and little air sacs. That's pretty much all that lungs are. And so they're not very dense at all. I mean, half of it is basically air. And so bullets can zip through that really easily, and a soft point design like this that has already been opened up going through the hide and the rib cage will just do all kinds of nasty things in there and produce a lot of tissue damage and produce a very quick kill. When you take that round, though, that's an intermediate cartridge and designed to expand and tumble and those kinds of things in the chest cavity, and put it into the gut cavity, you get a very different result. The hide will, of course, still make it expand, and the first few inches going in will cause that soft point to deform and open up and do weird things. But the gut cavity is much, much denser. You don't usually have nearly as much air like you do with the lungs. And in addition to the blood that you normally have in the lungs and in the heart, you also have the stool. You have the animal, what the animal has been eating and being digested. And digested material, by comparison, is actually relatively dense. And so the bullet is not able to travel as effectively in that category, in that cavity. And so that first shot that they took didn't actually wind up going through the deer because it was shot in the wrong place, and that kind of ammunition is not designed for that kind of a cavity. And So yeah, didn't work out all that well. So it went in, it didn't exit, and so the deer was wounded, but a gut shot is not immediately lethal. It can be lethal in time, but it's not immediately lethal. And so that was the first problem, and that was just an issue of accuracy. When you're hunting for sport, and it's not like these were people that if they didn't get the deer tags, they were going to go hungry that night or something like that. When you're hunting for sport, it's not an absolute requirement that you get this deer. The conventional hunter's morality is that you try to finish the animal off quickly. And what that means is that if you're not sure of the shot, you're not sure that you're going to be able to place it in the right place to get a quick, humane kill, you don't take the shot. That is just basic ethical hunting. Like I said, if it's a true, live or die type situation, then, valuing human life over animal life, you're going to kill the animal, and you'd be willing to take a worse shot if it means that you actually are going to be able to eat that night versus not. This was not their situation, and it's not the situation for most people in America. Most people in America who hunt don't actually need the meat. They make use of the meat because to not would be exceptionally wasteful, but they don't technically need the meat. It's not like they're going to go hungry that night if they don't get it. And so since you don't technically need it, you need to be moral and ethical in the shot, and that means that you don't take the shot unless you know for sure that you're going to hit the vital zone. Evidently, that was not the case with her because she didn't hit the vital zone. She didn't practice enough to guarantee that the shot was going to go like it needed to go. So the first mistake was her mistake. She didn't practice enough to make use of the gun. The second mistake, though, was mine. And so she shoots the animal once, and the animal doesn't go down, and so she immediately tries to shoot again, and of course with a semi-auto, that shouldn't be overly difficult, right? Well, like I mentioned, this gun has a full auto selector lever, and full auto selector levers are a little bit different when they're put on semi-auto guns, and this is a semi-auto gun. It just has a full auto selector lever, and the problem is that with this selector lever in the middle position like this, and this is the position that she originally had it in, well, that's technically the full auto position. Like I said, it's not a full auto gun, but that is the full auto position, and semi-autos don't run right when they're selector level, when a full auto selector level, talk about tongue-tied. When the full auto selector lever is in the middle position on a semi-auto that has a compatible trigger group, which this one also has. It's not a full auto, but it has some full auto parts. None of them that would make it an issue with the ATF, by the way. These are commonly used. But when it's in that middle position, what happens, and I'm just checking to make sure everything's empty, magazines empty, chambers clear. When you pull the trigger the first time, when it's in the full auto position, hammer falls as normal, and you get a normal shot, and that was the shot that went into the gut cavity of the deer instead of into the chest cavity. And the gun will automatically cycle, but if you have the trigger held back while it cycles, which is really hard not to do because it happens very quickly, we're talking about fractions of a second for it to cycle. If it cycles while the trigger is held back and the selector lever is in the middle position, what will happen is the hammer will actually follow the bolt carrier home, and I'll try to see if I can show you guys the inside of the cavity there. There we go. That little piece of metal that is sticking up inside of the receiver, that is the hammer. So the hammer has followed the bolt home, and so she releases the trigger and pulls again to get a second shot off because the first shot wasn't a good shot, and so she's trying to do the right thing and quickly dispatching the animal as fast as she could. Okay, first shot was bad. Let's immediately tap it and get this done and over with so that the animal doesn't suffer anymore. But she's pulling the trigger and nothing's happening, and so the deer winds up running away. And they realized that this safety doesn't quite work like they thought it did. And the problem with that was on me because I didn't explain that it was a full auto selector lever. With a full auto selector lever, if you want it to work properly as a semi-auto, you need to take it all the way down to the third position. Now, if it's a semi-auto selector lever, it doesn't matter if it's in the if it's in the middle position or in the bottom position, they'll both work as semi-auto. That is, if you have a semi-auto selector. But with a full auto selector, you have to be all the way down. And if you're all the way down with it like this, you fire off the first round normal, action cycles, trigger properly resets, and the hammer can fall again, which is what you want. But they didn't realize that there was a difference between the two positions, and I didn't tell them that there was a difference between the two positions because I simply didn't think of it. It's my gun, I'm used to it, I know that about it. I don't even give it a second thought. So I didn't tell them about it, and so they weren't able to get that second shot off as fast as they should have been able to, which results in more suffering for the deer. So I am partially responsible for that, and I do feel very bad about that. That's definitely not an optimal outcome. But they investigate the gun, and they say, hey, it can be pushed down a little bit further, so let's do that. And they cycled out the last round that had the hammer follow on it. And so now the hammer's reset, the selector lever is in the proper position. They track down the animal, shoot it one more time, and that takes care of that deer. That is just fine. All right, so that was the first daughter. Wasn't quite a perfect hunt because her first shot was off. That's on her. She needs to train more. And the second shot that she tried to take could have been much faster, but because of the issue with the selector lever being in the wrong position, they were not able to dispatch the animal as quickly as they ought to have been able to do, and that falls on me because I forgot to tell them about the semi-auto selector. So first hunt wasn't perfect. That was an issue. Oh, and in that first hunt, they also lost the rear end cap on the scope. And like I said, these end caps are just basically held on with tension. There's nothing particularly special about them. And so that was kind of an equipment failure more than anything else. And I'm not saying that PSA is necessarily bad, not PSA, but PA, Primary Arms, is necessarily bad for putting these generic caps with their scopes. You know, I could have gone out and bought my own if I wanted to, one of the nice ones that actually properly clip onto the optic and all that. I could have done that if I wanted to, but I didn't. And, you know, if you're using the cheap generic lens caps, then yeah, sometimes they fall off and stuff like that because they're not really held on at all. So, yeah, that was just kind of a poor choice in equipment. All right, so that's the first hunt, and then the second hunt with the other daughter comes up, and it goes much better because we've already identified these issues. We've already said, okay, these caps are not the most secure in the world, be careful with them. We've identified the issue with the selector lever. Oh, it was in the wrong position. You just need to make sure that before you shoot the deer that you take the selector lever all the way down, and you'll be good to go. So she knew to do that, and having learned those lessons, she was able to do one shot, 1 kill, which is optimal, and she was able to place the shot in the correct zone. That is, she hit the lungs, and it went right out into the chest cavity and right out of the chest cavity, which is what the bullet is designed to do. When you hit the right cavity that's not as dense, an intermediate cartridge will go through it just fine. The gut cavity, not so much, but through the lung cavity, it'll do just fine in that regard. So it went in and out of the chest cavity, and then the deer, when it was being shot, it happened to drop its head, and so the round not only went through the chest cavity, but it also went through the neck. And so both a chest cavity shot and a neck shot on the same animal, that animal was basically down before it really knew what was happening. It got shot, it sprung back up, and it went like 10 feet and it dropped again, and that was pretty much all that she wrote. So very, very, very quick dispatch on that one. Effective, did exactly what it was supposed to do. The system worked just fine in that case. That being said, there were some additional complaints that need to be mentioned. Okay, so there was the caps that fell off. There was the not knowing how the selector lever worked because it's a full auto selector. There was that, but then there was also the issue that everyone who carried the rifle was not used to carrying semi-autos. When they're in the field, they usually carry traditional, bolt-action hunting rifles, which frankly do not have nearly as many pokey outie bits as a semi-auto rifle does. And because of that, they found the semi-auto rifle to be rather uncomfortable. Add on top of that I think most, if not all of them, were left-handed, and the way that the sling was set up on this gun was set up for a right-hander, because I'm right-handed and it's my gun. So it was basically a right-hand setup being used by left-handed people. That did not go overly well. And so in terms of slinging it and carrying it, they didn't like it all that much. Fortunately, they didn't have to sling it and carry it too much, though, because they were able to get to most of the places they went on an ATV, and that's relatively common out here for a lot of hunting. ATVs are a relatively effective way to get to a lot of places. Yeah, it's not the most comfortable to carry, especially when it's set up for a right-hander and you're a left-handed person. That was a problem. And like I said, there were some hard lessons learned through it. But other than what I've talked about, it really didn't wind up being an issue at all. Yeah, in the future, if I go shooting with it, I'm definitely going to remember those lessons, make sure that I've practiced with a gun enough to know, if I can make the shot or not, so if I'm going to be able to place it in the correct zone or not. And that also is something that I would tell that young lady as well, is that, I did give you guys quite a bit of ammunition so that you guys could practice, and evidently you needed to practice more than you did. I'm not trying to be mean about it, but given that, this wasn't, a survival type situation, you got to kill the animal or you're not going to eat kind of thing, given that that wasn't the case, you really should not have taken that first shot in that first hunt. If you cannot guarantee that you're going to place the shot in the right place on the animal, you should not take that shot. Okay, the goal is not to get the animal. The goal is to get the animal humanely. So practice, 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 practice. And if I ever get into hunting, that is going to be my first order, is practice, 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 until I can hit a correctly sized target consistently from basically any reasonable distance that I would actually be willing to take the shot in the first place. And like I said, with this kind of ammunition, if that's what I'm limited to, about 200 yards is the practical accuracy limit for that ammunition. So basically, can I make that shot within 200 yards from basically whatever shooting position that I happen to be in? And I need to test different shooting positions, and I need to train with different shooting positions until I'm proficient. And that can take a while. Going out and, bench resting it, or maybe putting it on a tripod, shooting a few rounds at a close target and a few rounds at a far target, just isn't enough practice for most people. Most people need to go out, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and they need to have definitely a few different ranges set up, and they need to try quite a few different positions. And that training is what makes the difference. Get to the point where you can hit that target zone from anywhere in the effective distance that you decide that rifle is good for, and only after you're able to do that consistently, not just a few times here and a few times there, but able to do it consistently, then you can go out hunting, and you'll know when to take the shot and when not to. And if you're not sure, then don't. Like I said, if you're not in a survival situation, and it's not like you're going to, die if you don't get this meat, there's no reason to take what might be a bad shot and what would be an unethical shot. Okay. That is not a good reputation to have as a hunter, especially here in southern Idaho. Non-ethical hunters can be ostracized pretty quickly and easily, and justly so. So make sure that you train well beforehand. And then there's also the issue of the gun being heavier than a conventional hunting rifle and needing to train around that. So if I were to go hunting, I would definitely practice hiking with it. Not necessarily even have it loaded per se, although in certain places here in Idaho there are some rather nasty critters out there. I might have it loaded anyways, just for that. But actually go out on a few hikes with it and play with the setup a little bit until I find something that's reasonably comfortable, and rearrange things accordingly. And part of that falls on me, in that I set up the sling on for a right-hander, and all the people that use it were basically left-handers. So that again falls on me. Not explaining the issue with the safety lever falls on me. But accuracy is something that is up to the individual shooter to train on. And you need to train until you're comfortable. I mean, really, really comfortable, very, very, very consistent. And one of the hardest disciplines to learn for some people is when not to shoot. Okay, that is really the big takeaway from this, is knowing when not to shoot. And if you're not 100% sure that you're going to put that shot in the proper zone, don't take that shot. It's hard because everybody wants to go out there and get their deer or get their elk or whatever the prey item happens to be. But ethically, it is better to not shoot if you're not sure. Okay, the goal isn't to get the animal. Okay, you've got plenty of food at home, most of us at least. We have plenty of food at home. It's not a survival situation. It's a sporting situation. And in a sporting situation, there is no reason to be unethical, to even entertain being unethical. All right, so beat that into the ground. Yes, the AK works. It has already had 2 deer to its name. The relatively cheap soft point ammunition from Barnall factory in the Wolf label also works just fine as long as you put it in the right cavity. If you put it in the lungs, it zips through just fine and does the necessary tissue damage to take down the animal rather quickly. If you put it in the guts, it's an intermediate cartridge, so it might not go all the way through. You're not going to get as much bleed out as you would ideally like to have. There are issues like that. There's issues with it being a semi-auto, more complicated, all the kind of stuff that we talked about. But in the net result, it is a successful deer hunting rifle now. And there are definitely lessons learned, and hopefully you guys who are perhaps new to AKs or new to hunting will benefit from the lessons that we learned in our testing here. All right, I've rambled on enough. Thank you very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.